Greetings everyone and welcome to a special episode of Rimworld where we're going to be doing a bit of a tutorial, a bit of an experimentation with insulation. Now this is a fairly popular topic in the Rimworld community, and recently I've been getting a lot of posts in my comments on my videos just talking about insulation. I thought, well, you know what, instead of just parroting information that I've received previously that was on different versions and maybe outdated now, the best thing to do would be to actually test it myself and maybe even post these tests for other people because it might be helpful. There is a lot of information out there, and in fact I've drawn on other posts, other videos whilst I've been researching this topic, and I will have links down below to all of the Reddit posts and Rimworld videos that I've used. Now, with that all said and done, I'm running without any mods because I want this to be a vanilla experience. The mods will generally not affect it unless you're specifically playing with mods that say we're changing the way thermodynamics work. And this video is going to be split into roughly 3 sections. The topic of thermodynamics in Rimworld is, and by proxy, insulation, is a bit complicated, and it's very easy to get sidetracked by the numbers involved. So I'm going to try and keep things on the more practical side. We're going to have 3 sections. One where I cover the dev tools and how to set up tests, because that's another thing that I noticed in plenty of the Rimworld videos that I watched, is although people would present the tests, they wouldn't really explain how they set the tests up or how you could check this information yourself if you wanted to verify it. So we're going to be going over a little bit of that. We're going to be setting up some tests and then looking at raw numbers, and that's going to be the first part. Then we're going to do some practical examples and exercises where we're going to actually look at, well, it's all well and good we know how the heat transference is happening, but what does that realistically mean for me when I'm playing the game? So we're going to set up a couple of scenarios and just more of a simulate a situation and look at it rather than just theory crafting. And then the third part, we're going to actually look over the conclusions and what we can take away from what we look at. So what I think this all means and how we can apply it to our colonies. Now I prepared 2 maps, sea ice and desert. So we've got a cold and a hot biome. So we're going to start with sea ice. Okay, here we are on the ice sheet, or rather the sea ice. There's nothing here except for our colonist who's going to die a very slow and cold death, unfortunately. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our dev tool so that we can actually test. Now, to do that, you go to Options, go into Development Mode, just click that there. And then there's a few things that we want to do with these new icons that have appeared for us. First and foremost, we want to turn on God Mode. This will allow us to build anything instantaneously. And this is probably the biggest reason to use dev tools over just, you know, trying to set up the test by having your colonists to build it. I've seen quite a few people actually go through testing like that, and not only does it take a lot longer for them to do it, but it also it throws into question the validity of the test. How fair is it if you're trying to compare 2 rooms if you can't be exact about what heat those rooms were at to start with? And that's something that the dev tools will allow us to do very easily. Next up, we want to turn on unlimited power. To do that, you just go up here, open the view settings, so click on unlimited power, turn off fog of war. This will allow us to see inside mountains, which will become important later on. And finally, and the most important thing to do, turn on draw room groups. Now that's going to make everything look a little bit weird outside because it's just highlighting this massive room that has no walls or a ceiling. Now the first thing that we're going to be doing in this section of the video is just covering some of the basics. Now these are questions that do pop up every now and then, but have generally been answered fairly definitively, but everyone has reason. It's quite intuitive to question things like, does the material matter with insulation? You know, to be fair, it's a fairly straightforward question and quite a fair question as well. You would expect that it does. It does not, however. It does not for any kind of created material, nor does it for unmined stone. Now, I'm only going to show 3 different examples of this, and I'm going to ask you to take my word that it's true for all of them. But at the same time, I invite you to test it yourself. You can now do that. I've shown you how to use dev tools. The first thing you're going to want to do is actually make them rooms. They're not rooms unless they've got a roof. So just click in the middle, boom. All 3 are now rooms. We've just checked that they are completely roofed. You don't need roofs of the walls, only of the rooms themselves. Now, the way to test this is if we put in the same amount of heat into all of them. So we push 10,000 units of heat into these 9x9 rooms, and because each one is the same shape, it'll end up with the same equalized heat across all tiles. And then if you click on Inspector and have a look, it'll tell you how much it's losing through the walls. That's what those little green overlays are. It's showing where the heat is moving from this room and how it's moving out of it. And right now in the wooden room, we're losing 30.2 degrees every 120 ticks. We're losing the same in the plasteel room, and we're losing the same in the granite room. Now, it's worth just letting your mouse hover over the room for a few seconds, because sometimes it is a little bit slow in updating and you might be getting the data from the previous room you looked at. But as you can see, definitely the granite room is 30.2 and the plasteel room is also 32.2. Now that is true, as I said, of all wall materials that you can build out of and all unmined rock, including ores. Nothing has a different heat transference. So that's that question out of the way. The other thing I do want to quickly touch on is that corners do not make any difference. So if you go into the actions as well, you can go to Tool, Destroy, and we can just get rid of these corners. Now you'll notice when we hover over rooms, the corner tiles are not highlighted with green. The tiles next to them are not highlighted. And that's because they don't matter. They don't define a room. They're not part of how the game works out what a room is and what its boundaries are, nor do they transfer any kind of heat. So corners do not matter in the slightest for this. And that's true of double thick walls as well. If we draw out the double thick wall here, this room is still only pushing to these tiles. It doesn't care about these. Right, so that's out of the way. Now, there's a lot of information in the debug inspector. The next thing that we're really going to touch on is thin roof equalization. And that is the amount of heat that's leaving through the roof. Currently, there's only a thin roof. And if you're digging into a mountain, if you get deep enough, it becomes thick roof. But the first thing we want to check is that the roof really doesn't matter. The area of the room doesn't matter to the roof. You will lose the same amount of heat through the roof, whether the room is 3 by 3, 5 by 5, 400 by 400, if you could ever make a room that big, and it won't make the blindest bit of difference. Now, to test this, you actually need to make sure the rooms have exactly the same amount of heat, but because a different size room will take a different amount of heat, just keep clicking a couple of times until you reach 2000 degrees, and then you know that you've got exactly the same amount of heat, and so the transference should be the same. And as you'll see, the transference between these two rooms, the thin roof equalization, exactly the same. It doesn't matter, even in the slightest way, how big a room is. The same amount of heat will leave through the roof. Now, what you'll notice next, and I've added a couple of extra rooms just to make this example a little clearer, is the smaller rooms are losing more heat through their walls than the larger room. If we just wait for it to update there. So we're losing 23 on this smaller of the three, 20, and then 18. As with real life, a larger room takes more to heat or cool, but will hold its temperature much better than a smaller room. And that is true here. So the roof doesn't matter how big the room is, but how much heat you lose through the walls does. And the smaller the room, the more heat you're going to lose faster through those walls. So the general thing to take away from this is that square rooms are the most efficient. It all comes down to the kind of surface area, so the perimeter versus the volume inside. And a square room has the best ratio of walls to internal volume tiles. So the bigger rooms as squares are generally the best to insulate. They're the easiest to insulate at the very least. Okay, so the next test that we're going to do is another obvious one for some specifically. This is the test of a single wall versus double wall. Now, generally speaking, if the room is bordering the outside, so its wall is touching the outdoors, a double thick wall is always the best option. There are no exceptions. A double thick wall insulates literally twice as much. All of these rooms have been brought up to 2000 degrees so that we can do this test. So the single thick wall is losing 54.5 degrees of heat per 120 equalization ticks. And the double thick wall is losing half that, 27.2. And so obviously this one's going to be losing its heat half as fast. If we look at this wall, now this is when it gets a little bit less obvious. And that's when you're using cavity wall insulation, which is something that I have been a very big supporter of in my Let's Plays. And through the course of this testing, I must confess, I was wrong. The tests have shown me the light, if you will. But we'll go over it because there are some quirks with this. Now, the way the cavity wall works is that currently it's the same temperature as outdoors, and so this room is losing heat at exactly the same speed that this room is. However, if we let the simulation run for a little bit, what's going to be happening here is this room is bleeding its heat into this room, which is, again, bleeding its heat outside, but it's slowing the transference of heat down. In the short term, there's a very, very obvious benefit to double insulation over a single insulation or cavity wall insulation. But given enough time, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, I'm not going to, well, actually, I may as well let the simulation run while I'm talking. Given enough time, these two rooms will start to equalize their heat enough that eventually this room will be losing less heat per tick than this one. But we're talking several in-game hours to get to that point. We're down to 68 degrees here, and we're 58 degrees here. So we're 10 degrees colder despite having started at the same time. And in terms of how much heat they're losing, this one is now losing 0.91 degrees per tick. This one is only losing 0.7. Now, this is where things have gotten complicated. Quite a few people have been looking into this, and once they reached this point, they've walked away from the test and presented their findings saying, well, this is clearly shown to be more efficient over the long term. But this is a very, very specific example. How often do you manage to build an entirely enclosed room and then dump 2,000 degrees into the middle of it and then just walk away and wait? That's not how a colony works. You tend to be managing the heat over a period of time using heaters and coolers and things like that. And outside of this very specific example where you've just got a room that is a certain temperature and then just leave it, things get very different. So I will go on record here saying, for those who've been following my Let's Plays of Rimworld, you were right. It is better to have a double thickness wall. But there is a very, very important caveat. Here is where things get weird with double thick walls. If we push a lot of heat into, well, these two rooms are exactly the same temperature, so let's push all of the heat into the outside room. So now we're looking at a room that should be getting warm. If we look at this room, this room is super, super warm. Let's just let a little bit of time pass. If we look in here, this room is getting hot. It's getting very hot very quickly. It's gaining 40 degrees every tick. This room, not so much. This room's still only 1 degree. It's gaining 0.003 degrees every tick. And that's because outdoors is currently warmer than this. And that should clue you in as to what's going on here. Now, it's something I have discussed, and it's the main reason why I was biased against double thick walls, is because they have a very unintuitive interaction. And from what I understand, this was basically a resource-saving device in terms of programming. So the game didn't have to simulate too much. But whereas this room is siphoning the heat from outside, as you would expect, the room external to it, this room is siphoning the heat from outside. It's skipping this room altogether. As far as the game is concerned, this room is bordered by the outdoors. It doesn't have a 1037 degree room surrounding it. No. It has a 1 degree outdoors surrounding it on all walls. And so that's where things get weird, is when you've got a double wall internal to your colony, you're effectively creating a way for that room to link with the outside. Okay, and as our colonist is probably on the verge of dying, they've made a little snowman down there. That's lovely. One thing I almost forgot to cover is that having a double thick wall isn't only bad for the room that you're trying to insulate, in this case the inner room, but it's bad for the outer rooms, the rooms that are around it, in this case a corridor, let's say. Let's pump the heat up in both of these rooms back to 2000, so it's a nice fair example. But I've also added a bunch of cold snaps just to make this example a little bit easier and clearer to see. Right now this room is losing 35 degrees per tick. This room is losing 31 degrees per tick. And it would probably be a little bit easier if I filled this one up with heat as well, but we'll just let the simulation run for a little bit. Now, what's happening here is this room is bleeding its heat into the central room. Eventually, they'll equalize. And it's only really losing heat to the outside, but this room is losing heat in both directions. As far as the game is concerned, oh, there we are. I knew it was going to happen eventually. Sorry. It's losing heat to the outside wall and the inside wall, because again, this is a double thick wall. So as far as the game is concerned, this leads straight outdoors. In fact, it more or less does, because this room is freezing cold because it's also linked to the outdoors. So currently this room is -6, this room is 4. So as you can see, this room is behaving a lot more as you might expect, whereas these ones, because of the internal double thick wall, everything is going a little bit odd. Now, that also brings us to a couple of other quirks with too thick walls. Firstly, a too thick wall is no different to a 3 thick wall, or any level of thickness beyond that, and that's largely because of this quirk. Because this isn't really adding insulation, 3 layers of it doesn't add 3 times as much insulation as one wall, because as soon as it gets to the second wall, it's effectively equalizing its temperature with the outside. So the third wall does nothing, because it doesn't see beyond that. So for example, if we look in here, 28 degrees, and down here, 28 degrees. These 2 rooms are insulated exactly the same amount. Okay, so we've got 4 rooms exactly the same size. Each one is losing the same amount of heat. Now, when it comes to pillars, the game is somewhat clever about the way it does it. Let's put this in there. And now, to balance this out, I need to remove the same amount of floor tiles out of these 2 rooms, otherwise it wouldn't be a fair test. So now we're losing 26.565. Over here, 26.565. What you might imagine. These tiles, even though they're too thick, they're not linking to the outside. The game understands that this is meant to be a pillar. Now, where it starts to get a little bit curious is if you have a 3 wide pillar, then the game doesn't really know what you're trying to do here. You'll notice that this actually thinks it's a wall to another room. So this room is losing 31.95. Oops, I've put one too many walls in there. I do apologize. Let me get rid of that there. And this room is losing 29.886. So even though there's the same amount of available tiles in these rooms, this room is losing quite a lot more because this tile here is linked to the outdoors. And the same is true of any kind of configuration that creates that. So we need another 4 tiles in here. Actually, no, we only needed 3 tiles. Again, I apologize. Let's get rid of that. So this room, 30.49. This room, 28.463. So as you do this, now, the thing here to be aware of is this can actually be quite deceptive in that if you have, like, obviously here you've got 2 pillars right beside each other, but this almost, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, that's just a 1-tile wall in a cross. But the game doesn't treat it that way. The game sees this in exactly the same way as it sees a 3x3, because again, the corners don't matter. But it's got 3 thickness along the cardinal direction. So this tile here is actually bleeding heat. So it's 29.165 versus 27.169. So just remember that when dealing with any kind of double thickness wall or triple thickness wall, while it's great for the external shell of your colony, when you get to the internals, it starts acting in odd ways. Now, there's some ways you can use that to your advantage, but in most instances, it's probably going to do something you don't expect, and no one ever wants unforeseen consequences. Okay, now I've brought you to a desert biome, because there's just a few more things that we need to cover before we've covered all of the various permutations and concerns regarding insulation. Now, the primary thing that we want to look at here is mountains, and that is deep equalization. You may have noticed that when we had a room, let me quickly throw one together. And again, the reason why I can see inside the mountains is because I have turned off fog. If we make a roof here, then bring up the inspector, we'll see that it has a number for deep equalization and no reef equalization. Basically, these statistics are always 0 if they don't matter. And this room has no deep equalization right now. Deep equalization is specifically regarding the roof when you're in a mountainous area. So over here, it's thin mountain, so you would have to build a roof. You could even take a roof away. But where it's particularly dark, this is deep mountainous areas. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here, go to the destroy tool so that we can carve a path all the way down into the mountain, and then set ourselves up a nice little room for demonstration purposes. So we've got our little area in the mountain. Now you'll notice that this is deep equalization of 0.006C. Now that's talking about the roof. There's no equalization in terms of the walls because it's the same temperature as outdoors. Now, it's a very interesting part, this. Now, if I drop a load of heat in there, we're losing it through the walls, and we're also losing it through the roof quite quickly. Now, deep equalization only affects areas where it's above 15 degrees. Deep equalization works in a very different way to the regular way that temperatures equalize. What you'll find is that deep equalization will never heat up a room. No matter how hot it is outside, if you're under the mountain, it will never make it warmer, but it can make it colder. As it's doing right now, it's trying to make it colder, and it's going to make it colder towards 15 degrees. And once it hits 15 degrees, it's going to stop. And we can test that by pushing in a negative heat. Now, that's quite a lot of negative heat, to be fair. But you'll notice deep equalization is now 0. We're gaining some heat from the walls, but as far as the roof is concerned, no, there's nothing to be done here. It's already colder than 15 degrees. Now, it'll stop cooling things down at 15 degrees. Let's see if we can get... Oh, we went too far. Damn it. Very, very inconvenient. Let me see how many clicks it's going to take me to get up there. Oh, it's not too bad, I suppose. We can easily get up there, but we'll get up to 14 degrees, and you'll notice that nothing is going to change. So at 14 degrees, no deep equalization. 15 degrees, very small amount, and that's because we're not exactly at 15 degrees. We're like 15 point something. But the higher it gets, the more it's going to try and pull that down. And it pulls it down to 15 degrees exactly and then stops. And again, it'll never heat the room. It doesn't matter if this was minus 270. In the mountain, it would never get warmer, except from where it's pulling heat through the walls. Now, it does pull heat from outside, as you'd imagine, through the wall sections. And these walls, as I've mentioned before, they're no different to any kind of wall that you might build. So unmined rock or same amount of heat transference. So those are the two things to take away from deep equalization. It only happens when you're in the thick part of a mountain. It'll only ever cool the room below it, and it'll only do so to 15 degrees and then it stops. It will never try to heat it up. These are very important things to remember. Okay, welcome back. As you can see, I've been a little bit busy off camera. Now, we've got a couple of different tests that we can play around with now. This is the point where we're actually going to try and simulate a colony. So it's going to be temperature controlled by the colony itself. We are using infinite power, so none of these things are going to really run out of any power. And it's a little bit difficult at that point for us to tell which is the most power efficient. But generally speaking, while looking over things with Inspect, whichever one is the better insulated, is bleeding the least amount of heat in either direction, is generally going to be the one that's the most power efficient on the whole. Now, over here, we're going to be testing the deep equalization for freezers specifically. This one is, for all intents and purposes, a double thick walled freezer in the mountain, and this one's got a bit of a cavity. Now, of these two, I suspect that they're going to perform pretty similarly until we start seeing extreme temperatures, either extreme heat or extreme cold, and then they will do differently. If it's extremely cold, this one would be the better one, but if it's extremely hot, I suspect this one will be better because it's not drawing in that external temperature, at least not directly. Over here is a little bit more complicated. I've tried to set up something of a colony. I mean, obviously, it's not a particularly well set out one, but it does have qualities of a colony. So we've got external buildings around a central freezer. We are temperature controlling the regular rooms with heaters set to rise the temperature to 21 degrees and coolers set to drop the temperature to 23. So it should be hovering between 21 and 23 degrees under normal operation. The freezers are all set to try and cool the temperature inside to -10 and are exhausting their heat outside of the colony. Now, this is our bog standard one, single thick walls, the whole thing. Over here, we've got a double insulated outer wall, and if I were to pick one that I think is going to perform the best, it would probably be this one. Over here, we've got the double thick walls only around the freezer, but externally just single thick walls. Over here, we've got both insulated outer walls and the inner walls around the freezer. And finally, we've got double insulated outer walls and cavity wall insulation around the freezer. Now, this one's going to be a bit of an odd one, and it's very, very hard for me to make this in any way a fair test because the room is just such an odd size to accommodate the cavity walls. But I think it'll be an interesting one. This is more just to see what happens than anything else. Now, over here, these should both be pretty similar in terms of their temperatures. It's 20 degrees outside, but let's have a quick look. This one's accepting 0.175 degrees of heat. This one is accepting 0.233. Now you notice there that it did take a little while to update, and that's why I mentioned earlier that you do want to kind of hover over for a little bit. So this one's actually drawing in more heat than this one, but over time this little cavity will chill as this cooler keeps working, and eventually that might switch around. We'll see how that goes. At the moment, both of them are reaching the -10, which is what we want. So we'll allow things to go a little bit further. We'll see how these are doing. I mean, at 23 degrees outside, they're actually struggling a little bit. There we go. These two, ooh, very interesting. I'm a little bit surprised that under normal operation, these two are struggling as much. Now, this one's at -7 and is currently drawing in 0.32. Over here, 0.32. Over here, is that? Oh, 0.22. I was going to say that's a very big drop, 0.04. But 0.22, so that's actually a better one. And that's with the double double insulation around the freezer. I'm a little bit surprised by that. Over here, much the same, 0.23, slightly higher, but not by much. Over here, we are seeing 0.27, which is interesting. So this cavity wall is actually helping this, though it's still beaten by this one, which is a lot better, 0.23 versus 0.27. In terms of the rooms around them, the cavity wall one is doing fine, or 21, which is what I'd expect. Over here, very similar, and down here, very similar. A little bit warmer on these ones, I would say, but not by much. Okay, now I'm going to drop down some heat waves so that we can spike the temperature a bit. And I'm going to drop down, let's go all in. We'll drop down 3 of them just to make sure that it gets very, very hot outside. And I'm going to let a little bit of time pass, and I'll bring you back when we're ready to investigate how that has changed things. Okay, so the external temperature is now 70 degrees. That's quite blisteringly hot. Now, looking at the freezer temperature here, it's -2. -5 over here. So this one's actually holding on to the cold a little bit better. This room is getting warm by 0.4 degrees every cycle. This one by 0.2. So at this point, the cavity is actually starting to help out, which is what I expected, honestly. And it only just hit 0 degrees now, and externally it's 81 degrees. So that one actually, with one cooler, managed to keep this room at around freezing for a long time. It's drawing in 0.3 heat, and this one's 0.4 still. Now, of these rooms, let's have a look. It's understandably scorching hot in the rooms around the freezer. In the freezer, it's 14 degrees. Okay, that's not particularly good. Over here, faring a little bit better in terms of the rooms around the perimeter. They're a little bit cooler, but the freezer is much the same. Let's have a look at 0.193 and 0.235. So this one's drawing in a little bit less heat. Now, we'll actually look at the cavity last. Now, the room with the double insulation around the freezer, so internal, its outer rooms are scorching hot. And that doesn't surprise me at all. These rooms here are only getting the heat from the outside, whereas this one's getting the same amount of heat from the outside, but then doubling it because it's also drawing that from the double thick walls that are running around the freezer. And the freezer itself is 19 degrees. So in an extreme temperature, the double insulated walls are working against the freezer here. Now down here, I imagine this is going to be much the same, really. So 39 there, 34 here. How about you? 31. 36, 33, 30. Yeah, this is generally a bit cooler. This is 19 as well. So the internal double insulation is really working against it because all of the rooms in these colonies are effectively facing the outside on all of their sides, even though this one is only facing it on the very perimeter of the colony. Now to have a look at the cavity wall insulation. So 30 degrees, 32, 29, 27, somewhat similar to the basic colony, I would say, more so than the just the insulation around the outside. The freezer is at 12 degrees though. That's very interesting. Actually, that as much as I have extolled the virtues of cavity wall insulation in my Let's Plays up to now, everything that I've seen on paper so far was telling me that this would be worse. So I'm very surprised to see that this is actually keeping this room colder. Let's have a look at the temperatures of the cavities. 24, 26, that's interesting. There's no kind of cooling going on here. And if I'd been thorough, I would have also run the cavity down there, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. So this one's gaining 0.2 degrees per tick. This one's 0.19, so very, very similar. This one was 0.21. Over here, 0.23. So in order of how good they are, it's just the double thick perimeter, with cavity, then just the regular one. Now over here, 0.4, and down here probably similar, 0.4. So as I expected, having the double thick walls on the inside of the colony during a high temperature event. I mean, it's 81 degrees outside. This is a very, very high temperature. You wouldn't normally see this in a game. But it has caused the fact that the double insulation is actively connecting to the outside to be a bit of an Achilles heel for these two colonies. Now, normally you wouldn't see those kinds of extreme temperatures in normal play. So it doesn't really affect how I would go with it. I would probably say that overall this was the better of the options, though I am really, really surprised by how well that was holding on to its cool. Oh, that's actually changed around now. This is now 22 degrees, whilst everything else is much hotter. It was probably just the cavities were taking a long time to warm up, but once they were warm, it could no longer sustain it. So they're now actually bleeding extra heat in here rather than keeping it cool. Whereas this is just having to contend with the freezer. Over here, we've got 18 degrees and 11 degrees. So the cavity is actually helping here. But here, we're not actually drawing in that much heat. And especially because of the deep equalization is actively trying to cool these rooms. So we've got the deep equalization is fine in there. The deep equalization is trying to help with this room because it's already too hot. But deep equalization is actively trying to cool the cavity around the freezer in the mountain, which is a very interesting point. I didn't really think of how the deep equalization would affect it. So with that, I'm fairly happy at looking at some conclusions from all of this. So, in terms of what I'm going to be taking away from this, external walls of the colony should probably be double thick. I think that having a double insulated outer wall makes a lot of sense because it's effectively halving the effect of the external temperature on the colony. Rooms where temperature control is important should ideally be kept square and as large as feasible. Now, it's not always, possible to have an enormous room, but as large as it makes sense for the amount of heaters or coolers that you're going to be trying to use, and square would be the ideal for keeping a temperature-sensitive room at the most efficient. Next, I'd say that be very careful when using double thick walls on the interior of your colony. As we've seen here, when there is a high temperature outside, and deserts during the summer can get very hot, like 40, 50 degrees, and likewise in particularly cold biomes, they can get very cold during the winter. In a more temperate biome, you probably don't have to worry about this as much because it's only going to be when you have a heat wave, when you have a cold snap or volcanic winter or something along those lines, which is not very often compared to regular play. You'll not have to worry about it far more often than you do, but with extreme temperature biomes like deserts, like ice sheets, then this actually is probably something you want to consider when you're building your colony, because at least half of your year you're going to be in an extreme temperature range. So given the quirky way that double insulated walls work by connecting to the outside temperatures, I would say you probably want to avoid that in a high temperature or low temperature biome. Likewise, for the same reason, don't use 3x3 or any higher dimension pillars in your colony, because again, it's just going to be creating this heat sink with the outside. And ultimately, due to the nature of deep equalization, where it will never heat up a room. It'll only ever cool it down, and it'll cool it down to about 15 degrees. Mountains make a pretty good place to stick a freezer, or in fact a greenhouse, because 15 degrees is about where you want for your plants to be growing. And once you cool the freezer down below freezing, the ceiling is not going to heat it up. You will still be bleeding in heat from the walls, but the ceiling will no longer contribute to that in any way. So it'll definitely save you a bit of power on cooling and chilling the freezer area. But with that, I think this test is over. I've actually had a remarkable amount of fun just playing through this and researching the topic myself. And I'd be interested in doing some more things like this. If anyone has any particular topics on Rimworld that they'd like me to look into and maybe do a video on, do let me know down in the comments. But as for me, I'm going to have to go off and redesign all my colonies because, yeah, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Who knew? Well, you did, because you kept telling me, but shush, we're going to forget about that part. But that is going to be it from me. So as ever, do let me know if you have any feedback or you're interested in any other kinds of research videos for Rimworld in the comments below. And remember to leave a like if you liked, sub if you haven't. I'll catch you next time. Take care, everyone.